Today is May 28th, 2025, and my guest is Dr. and author Eric Topol. This is his fourth appearance on the program. He was last here in June of 2019 talking about deep medicine. Our topic for today is his new book, Super Agers, an evidence-based approach to longevity. Eric, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks so much, Russ. Great to be with you.
This book is quite an extraordinary summary of what we know and do not know about the human body and its health. And after reading it, I was struck by two things I'd like to start with. The extraordinary complexity of so many things we had little knowledge of. I would say 40 or 50 years ago, but for some of these topics, I think it's less than that. And how little we understand despite the growth in knowledge. So we know a lot more. We know about things being connected to other things, but we are often missing some fundamental understandings of the processes that we want to make better. Is that a fair summary?
I agree with you totally. Yes.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, one of the things that we had a misconception, which I think the data is clear, is how long it takes for these big three diseases, cancer, cardiovascular, and neurodegenerative, to take hold in our body. You know, typically as a cardiologist, we'd see somebody with a heart attack and say, oh, well, that must have been, festering in the recent weeks or months, when it's took more than 20 years. So this is, I think, a misconception we have. We also have this idea that it's all in our genes, and it isn't. So that, I think it's pretty darn clear that the studies that we've done, and particularly the Welderly study of the near 1,400 people that were over age 85 and never been sick, on no medications. I mean, they're hard to find, these people, right? But very little showed up in their whole genome sequence. So there's a lot of myths that we have to debunk and things that we don't understand. And I think, as you know, Russ, the thing that I emphasize most importantly that we don't understand is because we don't measure it, is how our immune system is either up or down regulated as we age. And that appears, if anything, to be the most important part of the healthy aging process, this kind of balance between the immune system and inflammation in our body. But a lot more work needs to be done there.
Yeah, I was struck by that, the importance of our very imperfect understanding of that. Also, the rise of, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the importance of the gut microbiome, meaning what's going on in our digestive tract, and just the complexity of the brain. I mean, some of the findings that you highlight in the book about the brain and what's going on in there, I'm thinking, we just found that out? I mean, weren't we trying to, isn't that an important organ? Weren't people kind of looking at that? But we got a lot to learn.
It's actually kind of so striking to me how many kind of brain breakthrough findings we've seen in the last year or two. I mean, just extraordinary. But I want to touch on the gut story, the gut-brain axis, because as you know, there's all this tremendous interest now in these glucagon-like peptide GLP-1 family of drugs. And what's fascinating about that is it's just the beginning of the story, because we have a couple of them on the market, Ozempic and Mounjaro, semaglutide, tirzepatide. The problem is that this is just the beginning, because there's 10 more gut hormones we haven't even started with, and there's going to be combinations of them, and they talk to the brain, and they also talk to the immune system. So the interconnects between the gut, our microbiome in the gut, as well as these hormones, as well as through the vagus nerve to the brain and the brainstem, it's amazing. So that we're seeing the unexpected with the GLP-1 drugs, like not just reducing eating, but actually healthy eating, changing reward circuits so that people stop their addictions to cigarettes or alcohol or gambling even. There's things that we didn't ever expect because of the circuitry in the brain and how the gut and brain interact. It's striking because, for example, Ozempic doesn't even really get in the brain directly. It only gets its message through the gut to brain axis. So this is one of the most important discoveries, because we have a drug class now that's wildly outperforming expectations. And we are still learning about not just these gut hormones, the double receptor, tirzepatide, but there's a whole bunch more coming. And so our ability to knock down inflammation and modulate our immune system is really going to be enhanced.
You mentioned, I'm going to talk about this for a little bit, and I was planning to get to it eventually. I'm glad we're talking about it now. Knock down inflammation. That's another thing that sort of runs through the book commonly, that, there's this problem with inflammation. Talk about that. What is that? What is that about? What's going on there, and why is keeping it down so important?
Right. So as we age, we were talking about these age-related diseases, this process of inflammaging occurs. There's several reasons for that. One is we develop senescent cells in our body. And you think about senescence, it goes along with aging, but some of these are good performing cells. That is, they can help for healing, and they can't divide any longer, so they're not really a source of potential for cancer. But some of these are really bad actors of these senescent cells, and they secrete these very potent pro-inflammatory proteins. So just like our immune cells that don't function as well as we get older, that's another term, immunosenescence, that can also secrete these proteins called cytokines and chemokines. So between these different cellular bad actors, if you will, we're prone to inflammation as we age. Now, why is that important? Well, it's one thing to get misfolded proteins in your brain, like amyloid and tau. It's another to have brain inflammation to those proteins. So that's untoward inflammation. The same is occurring in our artery wall. If we have some cholesterol buildup, plaque, atherosclerosis, but we get into more inflammation into that artery wall, that's how we get cracks in the wall and heart attacks. And then finally, with cancer, this is a real problem. If our immune system isn't got full integrity and really guarding us against an alien cancer cell because of its different proteins on its surface, that's how cancer gets legs, and it can grow and spread. And it would be very hard for cancer to really take over in a body if we had an intact immune system throughout our life.
Well, let's go back to the GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic. I haven't paid much attention to this. I would love to be thinner. The idea of taking a drug for the rest of my life that is brand new is not appealing to me. Seems like a high-risk strategy to get thinner. But what I didn't realize is I knew it was developed for something else. And oh my goodness, it's great for weight loss. And of course, that's an enormous source of revenue for the companies that develop these drugs. But the idea that it could do something other than that, and we barely scratched the surface, I didn't know that. And shame on me, because it's obviously enormously high potential.
Yeah, I think, Russ, as you know, I took through in the book this 20 years that we missed the whole story. 20 years that we could have been ahead of this. But it was because the people with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, when they took these drugs at the exact same dose, the same drug, they only lost a few pounds. Whereas people with obesity, their loss of weight can be extraordinary, 30, 50, 60 pounds, right? And we still don't know why. So going back to your first point, we still don't know why, right?
It's so weird.
Now, what's also interesting is not only have we seen the weight loss dependent effects, like on the heart, the so-called preserved ejection fraction heart failure, or on the liver, so-called NASH or MASH, or on the kidney. But what's really amazing is we see reduction of inflammation before there's even a few pounds of weight loss.
Wow.
So it isn't just that we get rid of adipose tissue that can make these, they were like a machine for inflammation, particularly belly fat. But the drugs themselves have a potent anti-inflammatory effect in the brain and in the body. So this is something that we're learned a lot more about really in the last year. And it's why it's possible the Alzheimer's trials that are ongoing and they'll be out early of 2026. If they click, and that's just where the Ozempic, which is a relatively weak single receptor drug, I mean, that would take it to another complete level. And we have some data to support that they will work, but we have to see, the rigorous placebo-controlled trials to make the call.
I'm learning a new language, trying to Hebrew, and it's a hard language for because its characters are different.
It's good for your brain.
It's good for I'm hoping.
Yeah.
I'm not taking the GLP-1, so I got to learn Hebrew instead. But what I'm noticing is that it's hard to remember all the words. I'm 70 years old, as I think you are, at least something close to it.
We're the
hard to
same
remember
age.
all the words. It helps to repeat them, use them. There's all kinds of different ways that, and a word that you think, I'll never remember the distinction between these two words, and you work at it, and you get better. But when you're 70, the pace is slow. And of course, there's some 2 steps forward, 3 steps back sometimes. How do you keep up, not with Hebrew, but with medical jargon, just the discoveries that are coming out every day in your field? I mean, this book, it's not just, you're trained, I think, as a cardiologist, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the scope of this book, and just in our first 10 minutes of conversation, the number of things that come off your tongue so much better than my Hebrew. How do you do that? Obviously, it's a gift, but what do you do daily to stay on top of things? What's your workflow?
Well, I suppose it's like you, Russ, because I know you are an avid reader. I can just see your library right behind you. I read every day, a couple hours when I wake up. That's my first thing that I do. Even before I'll have breakfast, I'm trying to be the infovore of just ingesting information. I've always been that way, and it helps me feel like I'm on top of things. I still don't have enough hours in the day. Oftentimes in the evening, I'll get back to reading too. So that's what I try to do, is like a daily dose of ingesting what I think is really interesting information, not always pure medical. It could be AI, it could be, something that's indirectly related, but somehow or other it comes together.
How do you decide what to read? Where do you get your feed from?
Yeah, so I concentrate on top medical journals, like Nature and Science and the likes of those. So those are very high priority. And I know each day of the week when they come out with the new stuff, so I'm right there, I'm reading it, and I'm trying to, synthesize what's going on. And then I'll be beyond the articles there. I'll read, of course, newspapers every day. Sometimes there's some really interesting nuggets in there, and books, worthwhile books. So between them, it isn't like on a vacation or holiday. I'm still reading a lot. I never get enough of that.
Yeah. So I have something similar. I think of it as a blessing. I'm not sure my wife always agrees, but she gets both what we call the positive and negative externalities from my reading habit. Let me make a small personal confession here and get your reaction to it. I have not slept particularly well, I would say, for the last 4 years. With COVID, COVID had a huge effect on the quality of my sleep. My dreaming was different. I think there was some anxiety in there, especially in the beginning when we weren't sure how serious it was. Then I moved to Israel. I'm an immigrant. I have a new job. I'm learning Hebrew. My work life became much different than it had been. And I find myself sleeping typically 5 to 6 hours a night. I try not to drink too much near bedtime because at the age of 70, I find myself getting up, which is just a physical reality. But I've always thought, I can power through this. I have nights where I get up in the morning after 4.5 hours of sleep, and, I just keep going. And I've always thought, okay, I'm not 100%. I'm not as sharp especially when I'm doing interviews. I don't remember everything I want to remember. But your book reminds me that it's more than just your effectiveness, that bad sleep has long-term health problems. So talk about why sleep is important and what I ought to know about it.
Yeah. Well, we've learned a lot about that, again, in recent times. And the data are pretty extraordinary, I have to say, because I didn't realize how vital this was. So there are several aspects of this. So one is what's called the Sleep Regularity Index, which I reviewed in the book. The data on that's pretty striking, that we need to be on a clock. And, I had the problem perhaps you've had where I didn't have this kind of regular bedtime. And, I tried to get more out of the evening than I should. And that's not a good idea, because what you see is the regularity is important, because it not only influences likelihood of dementia, but also cardiovascular and cancer outcomes. So that's one thing, is, establishing a time and trying to stick to it. I do that now just based on the data, although, it might be on a Saturday night, I'll, have that one deviation or something like that, going out with some friends or whatever. Now, the second thing is the breakthrough in understanding what happens during the night with respect to these metabolic waste products, also what you could say are toxins that we make in our brain. And they are pro-inflammatory, and we want to get rid of them every night, ideally, right? So there's a channel called glymphatics, not lymphatics. And that glymphatics, we've made a lot of discoveries about that in recent times, but that's how we clear these waste products. And they are particularly cleared in this slow wave of sleep called deep sleep, which is a subset or subpart of the non-rapid eye movement sleep section or category of your sleep. Now, that usually occurs early in the night. It sounds like, oh, deep sleep, that must be, way into the night. No, most of it usually occurs in the first couple of hours. And it's not so much how many hours you get, like if you get 6 hours, but if you get an hour at our age 70, if you get an hour of deep sleep, you're golden. That's really what you want to get after. Now, you mentioned alcohol, but there's a lot of things that influence deep sleep. And you can measure it now with a smartwatch, with a ring, a mattress sensor. The ring might be the most accurate way, but they all give you an index of your amount of deep sleep. And what I learned, you made a really good point. You don't want to have interrupted sleep. So I definitely hydrate in the morning and during the day, and really restrict fluids, in the evening, to not have interrupted sleep, have an avoid. But in addition to that, you have relationships to what you eat, when you eat. You don't want to eat late in the day, in the evening. You also, with what you do for physical activity, the more, the better, but not too late again, because that changes your sleep. Yeah, so lots of things influence deep sleep. And that's what, it's fine if you want to get 6 hours, may be fine if you have a solid component of deep sleep. And what's amazing, it took us all this time to understand the glymphatics, deep sleep, the interactions. Like atrial fibrillation changes the glymphatics performance. So it can have an adverse effect on deep sleep. Who would have guessed that? So all these interconnects that we just didn't know about.
I want to talk a little bit about something I think it fascinates me, and I'll do another confession. I like this. Listeners you can hear two old guys talking about, one of them's trying to get free medical advice and the other one's smarter than that guy. So I am vitamin D deficient, as I think many Americans are. Comes from working inside at a desk and not getting enough sunlight. And one of the risks of vitamin D deficiency is bone brittleness and vulnerability to falls and other many bad things. So many doctors have suggested to me I should take vitamin D supplements. My main reaction to that, and we don't really have to get into my own personal vitamin D issues, but more the generic phenomenon here. My worry with that is always, well, I'm going to improve my measured vitamin D, when the test comes back, because that's what the supplement is designed to do. It's designed to increase my measured vitamin D, which is not the same thing. And it strikes me it's better to get a little more sunlight. There's, of course, a risk of skin cancer, but I think it's quite small at the levels we're talking about. And so, and the same thing I'm thinking about with sleep. Is sleep that's artificially induced, say, with a drug? I don't take any drugs to help me sleep. Obviously, there's some things I can do that are non-pharmaceutical, such as not getting on screens, eating earlier, and so on. But I'm wondering about this general phenomenon, and I worry that a lot of our medical innovations are designed to improve the marker rather than the underlying condition.
Yeah.
Comment on that.
Well, you really nailed it, because so often we just assume that if you fix the blood test result, that changes the outcome. And we don't have that data for vitamin D. And as you say, a large proportion of the population has got low vitamin D levels, but it's never been proven. And this is a kind of across the board thing where you see it in lots of other examples, but this is a perfect example. It's never been proven that you jack up your vitamin D level and then it changes your osteoporosis or other vitamin D calcium dependent pathways in the body. So yeah, this is, I think, important. Now, the other thing, just to go back for a moment on the sleep story, the shocker was that if you take Ambien, and this likely applies to other drugs, but it's been studied in Ambien, it not only, it may make you feel like you slept, but it prevents the elimination of waste products. So it actually makes things worse. So you don't want to take those drugs. And so that's something that, again, we only learned that in recent times.
Yeah, my understanding is there have been a number of studies of the vitamin D question, and there's no evidence that it reduces osteoporosis, all type. What do you call it? All blank mortality, all cause mortality. So I'm not doing it, and I'm trying to get a little more sun.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the immune system. You write the following, which I think is really quite amazing. The recognition of the immune system as a common mechanistic underpinning for chronic diseases, whether it be related to why they occur or to the untoward sequelae that they induce, is an historic turning point. These diseases, heart, cancer, neurodegenerative, take 2 or more decades to develop, giving us a long time window of opportunity to prevent them. Atherosclerosis, which leads to heart attacks and strokes, endures despite progress as the number 1 cause of death and disability globally. It is due to inflammation in blood vessel walls, and all inflammation is generated by our immune system. Cancer isn't usually a killer unless it spreads, and our immune system can stop that from happening. If there were inflammation in the brain, it would be difficult for conditions like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's to take hold. And so this idea that, we talked about this already a little bit, but I want you to expand on it, this focus on the immune system, which this is a pretty recent understanding, it seems to me. Yeah. So tell me if I'm right. And tell me if I'm right about that, and talk about the future for what we might learn about the immune system that would make a big difference.
Yeah, this is, I think, fascinating. And if there was one thing that comes out of this research that went into the book, it's related to this. So going back, when we sequenced those 1,400 people that were, extraordinary elderly super agers.
These are elderly people who don't have chronic diseases. They're called elderly.
Yeah, no chronic disease, as opposed to the elderly, which is the common 60-some-year-old. Of course, it has often multiple chronic diseases. So these people, we thought we'd find a eureka effect in their genomes, and we found nothing. Now, the patient I present right at the beginning of the book, Lee Russell, she is typical. She's 98, and her relatives died. Her parents in their 50s and 60s, her brothers in their 50s and 60s. That is what we saw in this elderly super ager group. It wasn't a heritable pattern, and it didn't show up in the genome sequence. So now you say, well, what accounts for these people? Is it just luck? Is some kind of stochastic event? Or is there a biologic explanation? I would submit to you that from everything we know, because the genome sequence doesn't tell us about the immune system. If we want to know what really accounts for why these people just have this amazing health span, we need to study their immune system. And that has been done. In fact, one of the best studies, Russ, came out of Israel. And it's reviewed in the book. But as we age, certain people, they could be in their 90s and their immune system is like they're in their 40s. And we even have these immune age different clocks for the immune system. We even have an organ clock now for the immune system. So if we want to really get these 3 age-related diseases to prevent, markedly delay them, we need to be able to measure people's immune system as they get older, once they get past 60, 70, because we now have a way to up, like a rheostat, increase, decrease, fine tune this. And if we see somebody who's older and their immune system is down, that means they're going to be at risk for either cancer or, on the other hand, they may have this dysregulation start releasing these inflammatory proteins, which, drive the other 2 major diseases. So this is why keeping our immune system young is such a critical thing. And we're just now figuring out how we're going to measure it in people. What's amazing, I still can't get over this. In the clinic, if you come in and see me in clinic and I want to check your immune system, I have nothing to offer. 0. Okay. Here's what I get: a complete blood count to tell me the ratio of your neutrophil white cells to your lymphocytes. That is a joke. That's all I have, right? If I want to know, I got to study your T cells and your B cells and your autoantibodies, and I got to do perturbations. So people are working on this now. There's a human immunome project. That could be as important as the Human Genome Project, or more important. Anyway, we will get there, but that is the missing hole in our whole ability to prevent diseases.
But I assume at this current level of knowledge, which is embryonic, if I could use probably an appropriate word for this situation, even if we had that good measure, which is simply a descriptive tool, which we're just beginning to develop, and we find out that mine is old or too old for my age or much older or not healthy, or it's declining from the last year when we did this a year ago, we don't have it. Do we have any knowledge about how to make it better?
Yeah, actually we do. So
Tell me.
Striking. Yeah. So the 3 natural experiments, which are, I would say, even better than randomized trials for being an ideal way to look at cause and effect. So these are, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that just because of their birthday or just because of a healthcare policy thing, half of them got a shingles vaccine to prevent shingles and half of them didn't. And what's amazing is all 3 natural experiments showed that in follow-up, the people got 20 to 25% less dementia, less Alzheimer's from getting a shingles shot. Now, we never would have guessed that was going to occur. And if that was a drug that prevented Alzheimer's, can you imagine? So it doesn't seem that there's any real validity that these drugs take on herpes that causes Alzheimer's, but rather they dial up our immune system. And almost any vaccine can do that, but this is certainly one that is quite a strong immune response. That's why some people, when they get shingles vaccines, particularly on the second dose, they can feel like a bad flu illness because it's very immunogenic. It really activates our immune system. But in the future, we may not use just a shingles vaccine. We may have vaccines that are made just to rev up our immune system. And that's how these cancer preventive vaccines that are in the works, that's how they are fashioned, is just get our immune system amped up in a durable way for people who are vulnerable.
Note to self, get that shingles vaccine I've been putting off. Okay.
By the way, I did the same. When I saw the data, I didn't want to get it, but then I said, I got to do this. Yeah.
Just as an aside, I took 2 doses of the COVID vaccine in America. I moved to Israel. I got the third dose 6 months after that. And then, of course, I was encouraged, as many people were, to take the fourth dose and beyond. And my attitude at that point was the health risk of COVID for me, given it how it had evolved over time, and given that I had very few comorbidities, was relatively low. I wasn't worried about getting COVID. I'd gotten it in the meanwhile, so I had some natural immunity as well. It was like a flu, and it was not frightening at all for me. And so I decided I wasn't going to take those extra vaccines. And somebody accused me of being letting my politics overcome my judgment. I said, I don't think you know me very well, but how I think about risk. But I did wonder, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this are, that a new vaccine, and it was a miraculous, as you point out in the book, 10 month run,
Yeah, 10
unimaginable,
months,
unimaginable, that was a drug and a process, the mRNA drug, that we didn't know much about. And taking 4, which knowing that it played with my immune system, didn't seem like the best idea to me. Was that a reasonable thought, or was I just being silly there?
Well, no, I mean, you got 4 shots and you had COVID.
3.
I mean, that's
I had
3.
3.
3, and you had COVID, and that's building up a lot of immunity towards the virus. So that's good. I think everyone has to make the call. Those of us over at age 65, because that's where of course the risk really gets magnified, as to getting the additional shots. I mean, if you have comorbidities and you're over 65, or you have never had COVID, which of course is a minority now, or you're starting to see things really heat up in your region where you live in the world, and you want to be able to have some, resistance to getting protection from getting infected. I mean, I think it's a tough call, because the additional shots, 5th, 6th, 7th shots, they're not going to have nearly as important impact as the early shots. The problem we have with this virus, and it was diagnosed in Israel, is that not only do we get these new variants, but unfortunately, we have this waning immunity problem that we just can't keep up with that virus, so that, a year or 2 later, let's say, in the next year, we get a big wave coming. That once that is starting to take hold, that may be because of the waned immunity to get another booster. This is a really difficult thing, because right now things have been relatively quiet. There's a couple of variants out there that maybe they'll get legs, who knows? But, we're not done with this darn virus. And the worst thing is, unlike so many other viruses and pathogens, our body doesn't get a sustained immune response. It's just, even when you have a COVID infection, so you get to see the whole virus, not just the spike, we still don't get this durable, strong immune response against the darn virus. It's really a frustrating, vexing issue. And it's why a lot of people got disenchanted with the vaccines, because they thought, oh, it doesn't protect me from infection. Well, yeah, it's not great for that, especially after a few weeks. But it does, in older people, help for reducing the toll of hospitalizations and even deaths.
But my thought on this being a relatively new technology, this kind of a vaccine, it reminds me a little bit of the Ozempic thing as well. There's real euphoria about its impact on weight loss. There's huge potential for it to do more than that. But you have to take it for the rest of your life if you want to keep that weight loss off. And I'm always uneasy about, we just don't know much about, quote, the long-term effects. And it's an example of where our lack of knowledge of the mechanism that's underlying the efficacy of it is part of the challenge, it seems to me. We don't fully understand some of these things. And so to speculate what the long-term consequences are of staying on it seems a little risky, right?
Yeah, the comments I would just make is we do have 20 years of these GLP-1 drugs, and we even have for obesity now 6 years of follow-up in large trials. So we have a pretty good handle. It's not 20 years, or 30 years, but we have. And on the mRNA front, the one thing good about the pandemic, you're right, they were new, this platform, the RNA and nanoparticles, which, by the way, should have been improved. We should be using better nanoparticles and, keeping that mRNA from ever having untoward side effects. But we haven't. The companies that make these are stuck in the original version. But we got about 1 billion people exposed to them. So, wow, And so we have now, and the reason why it's important is that this same platform is great for delivering things to cells that we didn't have. So whether it's like a gene editing story or a cancer vaccine, we've seen some great results in intractable pancreatic cancer, renal cell carcinoma, and even autoimmune diseases. So there's a place for this platform. And the problem is, of course, because of some of the side effects of the mRNA vaccines we're seeing in the US, this anti-mRNA, that would be really unfortunate because overall it's very safe. It should get better. It hasn't. And also it's being applied well beyond vaccines.
Well, when you say companies are stuck with their original versions, is that because of the intellectual property protection that they're relying on and that it's expensive, therefore, for them to start from scratch? And therefore they just don't have an incentive to innovate, or is there something else going on?
No, I think part of it's the intellectual property. Part of it is, they have now had mass production of, hundreds of millions of vaccines, and to go to a new process.
Right.
The point being is we've known that the nanoparticles can be optimized so they even have better penetration. We have these things called self-amplified vaccines where you give much tinier amounts of mRNA, and that's approved in Japan, but there's not even a bit of effort to get that going in the US. That would help reduce the mRNA side effects. So we're just not, these companies, they did very well during the pandemic and they got things going quickly. That's great, but they're not keeping up with the field. And we're seeing in other parts of the world, the innovations that we need.
What's a polygenic risk score? Why is it important?
Well, it's quite important because when you think about your parents, and that one of them had this disease and one of them with this had, and what we don't acknowledge is that we are not the product of just either parent. We are the admixture of their genomes, right? So the polygenic risk score means that if you look at the common variants that account for, these are present in 5% or, more than a few percent of the population, we each get variants from our mother and father. Now, when you get hundreds of these variants that predict the risk of heart disease, any of the common forms of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, they become useful because they're one layer of data to tell you if your risk is significantly increased, right? So it's not perfect because, sometimes it's wrong. But for the most part, we're getting an idea that I have a high risk for, this particular type of cancer, or heart disease. It does help a lot to tell you a lot of people say, should I take a statin? Like you were going back to the LDL as a marker and fixing the LDL. Well, maybe you shouldn't fix the LDL, but if your polygenic risk score is high for heart disease, that's a really good test to tell you you'll benefit from a statin. So they tell us about risk, but they're just one layer of data that we want to look at all the layers. We have lots of layers of data now. The problem for us is they don't tell us when. They just tell us yes or no. So if you're at high risk on your polygenic risk score for Alzheimer's, well, that's age 98 or 68, right? So that's a big issue.
When you say variants, you mean genetic variants, I assume.
Yeah. So of those 3 billion letters, there's hundreds that are associated with each of these common diseases, conditions. And so those are the ones that the polygenic risk score measures. and you can get a score, 100 is very high risk and, all the way down to 0. And you basically, it's only meaningful if you're at high risk. Otherwise, you don't know what to do with it.
And going back to our previous discussion about, how my immune system's doing, what are our mechanisms today for generating those scores?
Yeah, so there's about 10 companies that do this. I mentioned in the book. It's very inexpensive. I mean, it can be done for less than $50, even $25. And we've done it, in academic labs because it's out of saliva and it's, it's an array. It's not a full genome sequence. So it's just a chip. And it should be part of the routine medical assessment. As I mentioned in the book, there's certain health systems that are doing this in all their patients now. And it's proven to be very useful in partitioning risk. And that's the key, is we got to find out who are the high-risk people, because you're not going to just get it from family history. We just have had this notion that, our family is wrong. I mean, like, for example, my family history, there's no heart disease. There's everything else. But when I got my polygenic risk score for heart disease, really high, right? So, and I'm sure it's accurate because I have other ways to check it. So, I think this is something that we're learning about, and there's resistance in the medical community to use it, even when it's, very inexpensive.
So I think some of my unease when hearing about it is the same unease I have about a full body MRI, which you mention in the book and speak negatively about it as I do. It's tempting to think, well, better safe than sorry. Let's be cautious. Let's find out what we're at risk for so we can take account of it. And of course, the full body MRI, first of all, it's very crude. It doesn't do a very good job, as you point out in the book, at perceiving things that are quite important. It tends to lead to false positives. You look like you have something when in fact you don't, which leads to interventions, which leads to bad outcomes, anything from infection to failed interventions that are just further testing and diagnostics. So what's the difference between that and the polygenic risk score? And the other part of it that I worry about is, of course, anxiety. So I go get let's take both you and me. You go and get yours, you find out, oh my gosh, even though my parents had very healthy hearts, it looks like I have a higher probability than otherwise might be the case for my particular genetic situation. And I find it for something else. I find some cancer. It turns out I have a high chance of, let's say, prostate cancer. Now, what do I do with that? What do you do with that? I'm going to sleep less well, and that's going to raise my risk of cancer and Alzheimer's. So tell me why, and especially when you're young, should young people be worrying about this? I mean, one of the themes of the book is this very nice insight that often you have a long time to find out about this something developing, and even something as nasty as cancer. If you catch it early enough, it hasn't metastasized. You're going to be okay. What do I do with that except worry? And what do you do with that in your own case?
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about the polygenic risk score or the MRI or both?
No, forget the MRI. It's a bad idea in my view. Although we don't,
I'm with you.
Although we don't dispense medical advice on this show. You consult your own doctor, an MRI provider. But I'd like you to talk about what do you do practically if you find out you have a genetic variation very different from what you expected in your own family history, say?
Right. So this is actually quite an important point you're raising. And let's use President Biden, former president, as an example. So his doctors followed the recent Preventive task force that says, don't even check a PSA. Well,
I think you've said that on this program in the past, and you're not the only guest who said so.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's a mistake, because this thing about prescribing something for all people is so dumb. Okay? Because what he should have had would be a polygenic risk score for cancers, and particularly prostate cancer. And if he had a high polygenic risk score, which has been shown now, the recent paper in the New England Journal about this, that partitions risk. That's the person who needs to have, very frequent assessment, and maybe not even just a PSA, maybe, even more than that. So this is the problem. Everything we have for, cancer screening is so dumbed down. It's like we're all cattle, we're not unique human beings. And it's like the same thing for everybody, the same diet, the same alcohol, the same this, the same that. And it's really a mistake, Russ. And this is why, these groups like the Preventive Task Force, they just treat all humans in the species as the same. Now, I think the polygenic risk score is just one layer of data. We're going to have a lot more. Like, for example, let's say you have that, it's high, and you have an immune system clock, and that's low, your immune system's down. Say, we're even going to up the surveillance to a higher level, right? And then there's, other things like, if you're really worried, you don't want to find a tumor on a scan, MRI, because that's billions of cells. You could do a blood test, for a multi-cancer early detection blood tests, which are getting better and better. You want to find a cancer, if it exists, microscopically, not when it's already spread to the bones and whatnot in the body. So we can do so much better, but we're not doing it. Yeah.
But I'm thinking about intervention. Once I go through this, if I did, and I found out I have a high risk score and I've got a bad immune system, what's the behavior that's going to come next? Are you going to encourage me to go on? In your case, you don't have to talk about your own personal situation unless you feel like you need my advice. And I am a doctor, just not the kind that helps people, as my listeners know. Are you going to go on a statin? Are you going to get a preventive stent put in? Are you going to, in the case of cancer, are you going to take out the prostate, before it becomes cancerous? I mean, that's a very high risk intervention for an uncertain thing. Now, with certain kinds of, with breast cancer, it's well known in the Jewish community. There's certain genetic variations, and you'll know the name. It's BRCA, I think.
BRCA 1 and 2, yeah. You
have a very high chance, and many women do interventions to avoid that risk. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but I'm just thinking, telling me that I have a risk, an elevated risk of something, I need more than that. I need to know what to do that's going to be good for me, and it isn't, have these other downsides.
Yeah, well, I just want to touch on the BRCA2 gene, because in the book, I review that everyone in Iceland essentially has their BRCA gene, the whole genome sequence. And knowing that is a 7-year life difference, because in men, people who are BRCA2 positive for mutations, they have a much higher rate of cancer, particularly prostate cancer. And that's another thing. If you want to see polygenic risk score, BRCA2 mutations, I wouldn't take the prostate out, prophylactically, unless there's some, horrible symptomatology, right? But what you get at is, I want to put this person under, tight surveillance. And by the way, these things about lifestyle we talked about, touched on the sleep and exercise and diet. These things are really important, because you can't get everybody to adopt a healthy lifestyle. That doesn't work. But when you have a specific risk and you sit down with the patient and you say, you know what, we're going to go into high gear prevention now. We don't want you to get this whether cancer. And this is when we're going to really go after the things that we know in lifestyle that will help you. Now, the chances of somebody doing it is much higher when it's, for them.
Just had the same thought. And I have to confess that reading your book has improved my dieting over the last 3 days since I read those sections about belly fat. So I'm making a joke out of it, but it's not funny. It's not a joke. It is funny, but it's not a joke. And I think your point about motivation is not a small thing. What's the opportunity? You talk about gene editing. What is the opportunity for gene editing in general, and especially in these cases? Is there, as we get better at this, is there an opportunity to do something different than a prophylactic removal of a prostate?
Yeah, so this is amazing because genome editing, people think about that as just an approach to rare diseases. And there's thousands of them that are these classic Mendelian gene mutations that you could fix, and not in the embryo, but in the actual somatic mutation in the body of a person, whether they're young as a baby or older. Now, the reason why this is so much bigger than that, because some of these rare diseases have common threads with the common diseases. And two that I'll just mention quickly in the book, also highlighted. If we can completely get rid of the cholesterol production gene related to this so-called PCSK9 fancy term with a one shot, or a similar gene, if we could give that to people, that would basically markedly reduce throughout their whole life. They wouldn't have to take a statin. They wouldn't have to take any drugs because we basically took that specific gene that was causing high cholesterol. We took it out, right? By the same token, many of us are ApoE4 carriers that carry a significantly higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. And so these are common diseases, heart disease, Alzheimer's, and we could genome edit our ApoE4 to make it ApoE2, which is a much more favorable form of that allele. So that's what's so exciting is it's not just rare diseases. This genome editing story, and it could even be applied to our gut microbiome to change the bacteria sequences in our gut. All sorts of opportunities there that are out there to develop.
Talk about where we are with AI. When I mentioned my feelings about vitamin D, I've had them for a while, this impression. But I recently, just because I love the tool, went on to ChatGPT's O3 new research, think longer thing, and asked it about vitamin D supplements. And it was an incredibly thoughtful response. And it also, of course, what's amazing about it, it gives you the sources. So if you want to click through and see the study to evaluate whether it's a good study that it relied on in making its conclusion. Of course, it does hallucinate sometimes. When it tutors me in Hebrew, by the way, it'll often get the vowels wrong and sometimes get actual conjugations wrong. And I'll give an answer and it'll say, no, that's wrong. That's we run. And I'll say, well, no, we run and they run are the same. And it'll say, oh, of course, I'm so sorry. So it has some funky problems and health is not, is more important than getting the verb to run conjugated correctly. But I'm curious where you think we are on this. Certainly as a tutor of my own health situation, it's somewhat dangerous, but also phenomenal because I can't call you all the time. You're in California, tough time zone, It's a phenomenal diagnostician, and people I think are using it like crazy to figure out whether they need to worry or what they should do about things. But it's also going to do other incredible things, I suspect, in developing therapies and treatments. Where do you think we are, and what do you think is coming?
Yeah, I'm really impressed with O3 and these deep research tools. Yeah. They're incredible. I mean, as you say, you get a report and all the citations, and when you check them, most of these are real citations. They're very up to date. Right to the last week, or it's crazy. So, yeah. The main point about AI, I've been following the AI story, particularly in healthcare now for several years. But I do think what we're talking about today is the next frontier. And when I say that, I mean, we have all these layers of data. We haven't even talked about, the proteins, which turn out to probably be more important than the genes, these so-called organ clocks from the proteins, these protein markers, and the polygenic risk score, the usual stuff in medicine, like the labs and the scans and the electronic records and whatnot. You have all these layers of data. You couldn't do anything with it as a doctor unless you had multimodal AI. Because now what we're talking about is you're not just saying the person's at high risk for this particular condition, but you're also saying when. So no longer it's a yes or no. You're giving temporal account for within a couple of years. This is when if we don't do anything, this is when it's most likely to show up as a beginning of symptoms. So we're at this extraordinary time. We never had this ability for prevention. And so a lot of people keep talking about how AI is going to change healthcare and all these AI drug discovery companies that haven't yet discovered too much, but there's lots of them. I'm thinking, no, that's good. Let them go find some new drugs and targets and candidates, whatnot. Let them rev up clinical trials. Good for them. I love it. But what I'm seeing, Russ, is that we have prevention. If you have prevention, you don't need new therapies, okay? You just need to prevent. Prevention is a lot smarter than treating and trying to cure. And if as you, an economist, you know more than anyone, preventing these diseases like Alzheimer's, the bang for the buck, if that
Huge.
is, yeah. So that's what we can do. And that's why I think AI's biggest contribution in medicine going forward, and this will take a while, it always takes much longer than it should, is to rev up our ability to prevent the 3 major age-related diseases.
Cancer, heart disease, and neurodegenerative Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, right?
And cancer, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Did I say cancer?
Oh, you did. I missed it at first, I think,
Okay.
yeah.
So if you're out there listening, what I find fascinating, and this happens when I read your book, part of your brain is thinking, there's some cool ideas here. I'm gonna learn more about them. The other part of your brain is saying, I don't like the word cancer. I don't like the word Alzheimer's. I don't like the word heart attack, stroke, etc. And there's a huge psychological phenomenon where these things are becoming front and center in your mind that you, if you're like me, you prefer not to think about them. I'll throw in shingles. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I'd like to have good health and I would like to take advantage of modern medicine. Maybe I'll look into this polygenic risk score, or maybe I'll think about we didn't talk about fecal transplants, so we'll leave that for another episode. There's some very creative things people do with gut microbiome. But it seems to me that really the lesson of your book at the grossest level, meaning the biggest, crudest level, is don't smoke, eat good food, but not too much, because obesity is really bad for you, and exercise. So if you're listening out there, if you get one thing out of this conversation, which I've enjoyed immensely, those are all under your control. Your genes, they're tricky. You don't have a gene editor yet in your back pocket or in your wallet, but you do have a lot of control. And one of the themes of your book, and I'll let you close on this, is that the things that we can control are actually pretty important. And we used to think, oh, it's all in your genes. You're stuck with that. Whatever your parents gave you, that's your destiny. And you argue a lot in this book that actually you have some control. The biggest one is don't smoke, for sure.
Yes.
But don't be obese is a good idea. Eat good food, not overly processed and not so much sugar. Good idea. Exercise. Walking is really good and not horrible to endure. React to that unfair summary of your magnum opus here.
No, I like it's not unfair. It's fair. I mean, of course, as we discussed, sleep is also more important than we've realized.
I forgot.
Yeah.
That's in that list. I forgot.
And then, the exercise, it's not just aerobic that I always thought, the resistance training and the balance training, that's important. Now, what I didn't realize until I got deep into it, and I didn't have the help of O3 or any deep research when I did it, is that you get 7 to 10 years of healthy aging if you do all this stuff, I mean, who would have guessed? 7 to 10 years of healthy aging? And you got all these, predator companies and anti-aging supplements and all this, real bunk out there where you just do these basic things that, of course, they've been enhanced now. You get a lot more healthy aging. And just go back to the central point. We should be liberated that we're not destined to have what our parents had that, compromise our health span. That is a miscue. I've learned that. We had to study a lot of people. It took 7 years to find all those people and then do the whole genome sequence. But it isn't that no question that genes do contribute to healthy aging, but they're not nearly as big a deal as we had been accepting forever, seemingly. So yeah, but the problem with what you just reviewed, Russ, it's very hard to get people to do all these good things. And so that's why I think that partitioning of risk is going to help people, because you add the lifestyle factors with the other things we can do, when you have somebody under surveillance. That's how we prevent the disease. I don't think we're going to get 8 billion people around the world to all of a sudden adopt all these wonderful healthy lifestyles. I wish, but that's unrealistic.
No, just the listeners to EconTalk, and that's a start. My guest today has been Eric Topol. His book is Super Agers. Eric, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks. What an enjoyable, fun conversation.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.